So I am really delighted to introduce to you today Shelley Poticha, who's one of the world's most amazing people. I mean, she has done the things. She was for a time the executive director of the Congress for the New Urbanism. Most of the time I was going to all those things, ran a great show there. She's been involved in things like Reconnecting America. She's run several things. She ran the Sustainable Communities Program, a partnership between the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy. No, the Department of Transportation, HUD, who else? Environment, and ultimately more of those, EPA. And it was that program that got us a $3.75 million grant in Houston to produce the first regional plan for sustainable development, which I believe was passed about a year and a half ago. So she helped us get that done and so forth. Today, she's at the National Natural Resources Defense Council, where she does urban solutions. She's the director of urban solutions. She's a great storyteller. Come up, tell us.
Now I'm so intimidated by this machine. I don't know if I can pull it off. Good morning, everybody. It is really, really terrific to be here, not just because we've started to get frost in DC, which I don't really like, but boy, those were 3 phenomenally inspiring starts for the day. Incredible. I kind of think you don't need me, because I think you're already on the way. And what I wanted to talk about is sort of my latest thinking about how we can solve both kind of our big challenge, the planetary challenge of climate change, and the big challenge of making places where people thrive. And getting the invitation to be able to speak to you was terrific, because it's right at the core of where I've been working lately, and have the opportunity now. I'm working for one of the country's largest environmental organizations, a group that has historically focused on saving and protecting natural habitat, working on campaigns that help clean, say, power plants so that they're not polluting as much. And when the organization puts out their materials that really talks about, like, why should we be doing this, they always cite a polar bear or a otter or an iceberg. And what strikes me is that this problem of change, climate change, is so urgent. We need to find a way to bring it into people's hearts and have it be relevant to us every day. And that only begins to happen when we start putting ourselves into it and start thinking about the places that we live in, the communities that we live in, our activities every day, and frankly, looking at our own personal priorities as a way of urging people to take action in new ways. So I came to NRDC about 2 years ago, and I was asked to create the first cities program. The first time that this group had really kind of looked at the challenges of environmental movement from the perspective of someone living in a city or a town or a village. There'd been lots of little projects here and there, but nothing as kind of comprehensive. And we started this incredible conversation. We've had a lot of fights. We are still debating intensely about where should we put our energies. Is it more on the nature side? Is it more on the people side? And how does all this kind of knit together in the way that David just talked about? how can we come to some sort of alignment that helps us move forward? And frankly, we need to move forward very quickly. I was in London 2 weeks ago at a meeting of philanthropy that funds work on climate change, and saw pictures and reports from all these big think tanks who basically are saying that unless we start turning the boat, turning the trajectory within the next 5 years, that's not very long, particularly when we're talking about cities, we're going to have a very hard time meeting these big goals that we're having international conferences to try and negotiate. And a lot of people who are working on climate are, very importantly, working globally. I say that we in the US need to lead the way. It's not just because I was a federal government hack for a while, but it's because in my travels all over the world, what I see are other countries replicating our mistakes. And we need to lead, we need to show that we can conquer, we can really address the needs of human habitat and nature habitat together. We can do it in ways that meets people's needs, that is practical and pragmatic, and we're going to make a difference. And it's really, I think, only when we grab onto this opportunity. I really think there's an alignment of stars. We heard about the demographic last night. I think the market is with us. Jaime talked beautifully about the urgency. But I think there's a real way that we can move forward. So this presentation is really very much about how can we begin to come together and craft a movement that isn't just environmentalists over here and urbanists over here, but how are we going to really come together? And frankly, I think we have to, because without that, we're going small bore. We've got to get a little bit more aggressive here. So I'm thinking that this, no, that's not it. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, I think it's often forgotten that so many of us live in cities and suburbs, and we can tackle so many interconnected issues if we start looking at the issues of environment from the perspective of where we live. And as I said earlier, I think that we have, particularly in the US, made some decisions that have put us on the path that we're on. The number of people that I spoke to at breakfast talking about traffic in this region was incredible. And in many ways, what these pictures show is an approach that is not resilient. And in fact, what I'm learning when I've started looking into language that works with people in communities, issues that really resonate with a very, very broad spectrum of people and interests and geographies, is that the importance of resilience in our economy and our environment against big weather, that's really resonates with a lot of people. And unfortunately, this approach is really not particularly resilient. And it's really time for us to tackle this new set of challenges and redirect the path that we're on, particularly in the way that we're building our cities. And in fact, we actually already know how to do this well. We've got pilots and best practices and great examples all over the place. It's now time to, I think, move beyond kind of little pilots, and let's really look at the underlying strategies that are going to help us get to a more resilient future. And we heard last night a little bit about the demographic shifts and how that really begins to play into the future. Jaime talked this morning about the mix of Latinos and Blacks and Asians and Anglos in this region and their growth. And we have a different set of issues that we can all grab onto and frankly use as a platform for making our cities more resilient and making our surrounding environment healthier. And this is just one lens into this. You could do this same set of arguments about how the next generation is tackling and dealing with a really different set of issues, and frankly motivates them to make different choices than the baby boomers that we heard about last night. And many of those choices are actually very aligned with the walkable neighborhoods that David mentioned. One of the other kind of factors that I have been focusing a lot on is how can we really focus on wealth creation in America? And we often talk about it in terms of jobs and minimum wage, and those are very important. But we also want to look at our regular budgets and what can we do to save money in our everyday lives. This is from a database that I helped set up when I was at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it looks at the combined cost per household spending on housing and transportation. You can look up any place in the US, and this data is there. You can also use this data to be able to shop for a different house or an apartment in your community, and it'll help give you information on how much do you think you're going to be spending on rent or mortgage, but in addition, how much are you actually spending on transportation costs? What are your options to get around? Is it actually more expensive to live in this place when we look at the total cost? We should add energy into this, by the way. Is it more expensive to live here than I thought? And this is a part of this issue that I wanted to lift up. When you look at Houston, this is just for the median family. Look at single-parent households. Not only are people spending far too much on housing in this region, but when you add it together with transportation costs, can you imagine a single mom making it when they're spending so much of their income on just those two expenses? And I would be willing to bet that if we put a map of the highest performing schools on top of this in this region, the dark areas, which have the highest costs, are probably also the places with the best schools. And that's what limits opportunity. This is part of what really drives people in making decisions about where and how they live. And we ought to be thinking about drawing in this kind of information if we're going to expand the group that we're talking to. These are photos that may or may not relate to this region, but I think the fact that the major storms that have happened over the last, 5-10 years are really becoming more frequent, and it's causing a lot of damage, and frankly, it costs a lot of money. It is a way to get, people are starting to pay attention. People are beginning to realize that, oh, this isn't just like a once in 100-year event. That language is so deceiving. I'm going to have to deal with this. And it does bring it to a very personal level that talking about zoning doesn't really do. But part of what I was saying earlier is that, we know how to embed what we call green infrastructure, natural infrastructure systems into cities in ways that retain its vitality, It's not like, you know, changing an urban area into a prairie. We know the techniques of integrating green space that can help us when we have a major rain event. And we're starting to see some really terrific examples. One challenge is, and maybe Houston's not in this case because of the Bayou project, but one challenge is that we tend to see these projects be like little demonstrations, like a little street, one block where maybe we took some of the parking spots and made them into rain gardens. Great, not enough. We have to start insisting that we go bigger because just from a practical standpoint, not only are we not going to be able to handle the water that is coming, but we're not actually creating the jobs in our communities that are going to help sustain people, that are going to live longer than that one little tiny demonstration project. If you're looking for an amazing example of green infrastructure, Prince George's County in Maryland is doing, hands down, the most exciting work, where their measure of whether or not their storm drainage system is effective is not just, does it hold the water, does it clean the water, does it create habitat systems, but how many local jobs is it creating, and how many small businesses is it sustaining? And when you start translating these issues of incorporating green and nature into your cities, when you kind of flip it into the core issues that people care about, you start getting many more people on your side. Now, I like to show this because it's super geeky, and I'm like work for a big enviro group, and most of their slideshows are just these big charts. But I want you to focus on those two, what they call wedges. This is the carbon pollution emitted from the US from the transportation sector, and the light blue represents the standards that are in place for making vehicles more fuel efficient and promoting electric vehicles. But we're not going to get to the goal that we need to get in order to fight the pollution that is harming our planet until we start looking at the green wedge, which is the amount of driving that we're doing. That very focus of the way that we build our cities so that people can walk, bike, take shorter trips, maybe just park and take care of several trips on foot. We have to start driving if we're going to start actually making a dent in this. And yet, this is where often we fall off, because we can be in this sort of abstract chart world, but this is actually the reality that most people experience. So we're not going to get any traction on getting people out of their cars if this is the experience that they have every day. So it's all beginning to connect, that the way that we build our cities can have a substantial impact on our environmental outcomes. It also really can have a substantial impact on our everyday lives. And I would posit that by bringing these together and focusing on what people generally think of as the basics of life, access to housing, a good job, affordable living, good schools, these are all the same things that line up with a vision of a sustainable city. So that's part of what I've been working on, is how can we kind of flip the language? Let's have the confidence that as urbanists and as environmentalists, that we can actually find a pathway to talk about this that's going to bring people in who may not even name themselves as an environmentalist or a city lover. I just did a poll, like an opinion poll nationally, and the number of people who kind of self-identify as people who love cities is just very few. On the other hand, the number of people who kind of related to these, strategies was up in the 80–90% level. So I just urge you to think strategically, creatively about how to do this. So the second half, or the second part of my show, my slideshow, really just takes maybe 10 ideas that, frankly, I already saw this morning, so I'm not sure we need to go into them all that much. But what I would say is that now that you have a foothold, you have Plan Houston, you have all of you who are clearly really dedicated, you've got leaders who understand the vision and know where to go. Think really strategically about how you're going to achieve each of these solutions. What's the strategy that's going to get us there? How can we bring many people into the conversation and get them excited about a new vision? So we've already heard about walkable neighborhoods. I would also say that when you start to connect the data, you can talk about the value of walkable neighborhoods in so many ways that relate to so many different interest groups. It's really important. I think the fact that you can lose weight is so good. Green infrastructure, I mentioned that earlier. Last week I was part of a group that was looking at cities all over the US that were trying to make themselves more resilient to major storms. And I'd say more than half of them were looking at water as their big issue. And what was so interesting was that while they had often designed kind of the major features, the water that runs into the rivers and the bayous and the connections from the neighborhoods were often lost. And that's actually part of the water system. It's a watershed with many tributaries. And in fact, if we start looking at natural systems that intervene, parks where the water can percolate back into the water table, linear systems where the water can go back into the bayou. Those are really important because they make the whole system healthy. But they also can become the counter to the Trust for Public Lands measure that Houston doesn't have as much green space that's accessible to people. You can have parks throughout your community. You can have bike paths that allow you to get from your house to the bayou and clean the water. And frankly, they're less expensive for the city. So it really is kind of a win-win-win. A more challenging issue, just when you think about cities, is how can we make sure that we're linking up jobs and housing? It gets back to those maps I showed about how much people are spending to get around and how much they're spending on housing. We need to be more intentional here. And I understand how hard that is, but part of the way that major employers attract workers is by providing transportation options, by lowering the cost of living, but still having a vital city. And so transit has to link up with where people are actually going to work. And we have to think about all different kinds of jobs and how they fit in. And the more that we can make the case to business that we're actually saving them money, I think the better. Now, again, I understand how difficult this is. The sharing economy is just like, this whole wave is just on fire. Your region actually, I think, is incredibly well equipped to take hold of bike share, car share, ride share as a key component. I'm working in the city of Los Angeles, also a city built around and by the car. They're all over this. Creating mobility hubs, sponsoring new apps, providing all the data so app developers can make it possible for you to make seamless decisions about how to get around. It's not a transit trip or a car trip. It might be all types of trips that gets you where you want to go fast and with the least amount of cost. So, and when we start embracing these technologies, we're reducing the amount of driving. We're driving down driving, as I talked about earlier. Often I think that we sort of forget that a core part of people is their pride, is their comfort in a community, is their relationship to traditions, and the small things that make a neighborhood unique. I think maybe in the 80s and 90s, we just built our cities, so quickly, and every place looks the same. And this idea of paying attention to the details, paying attention to what makes places unique, welcoming people's cultures as a core part of how we think about our rebuilding strategies. I think it needs to be elevated. I'm working with a group also in Los Angeles, Little Tokyo, and they are right in the path of development because a new transit station is opening up near them, and it's right near City Hall, and the housing economy is just on fire. And this is the last Japanese-American neighborhood it's the largest and last on the West Coast in Southern California. And they don't want to lose that history. They don't want to be just like a little plaque someplace on the side of a building. And so they've come together and they've rallied around this really interesting word, montanai. Montanai in Japanese is apparently, I don't speak Japanese, it's about don't waste anything. Use all resources efficiently. And that has become the touchstone of their revitalization strategy. So they've got water incorporated into everything. Nature is right there. They've got cultural spaces, but they've all connected it to something that's very meaningful to them and their community. And that's helped rally and engage people, kids all the way up to the elders. It's really exciting. We've already heard a little bit about food today, and food is it's such an incredible, I guess, can opener to getting people to have a conversation about who they are and where they live and what they want better in their communities. But there are some ways in which we can really use the growing food movement to make a big difference. I work with another guy in my organization out of New York who's working with the largest school systems in the country on their procurement standards, so what they buy. They've come together and they've already driven down the cost of compostable trays and silverware and plates as opposed to styrofoam because they're doing joint purchasing. They're requiring compostable stuff as part of their procurement standards for all their schools. Now they're looking, they're in the last few minutes of requiring antibiotic-free meat. Next, they're going to look at, they're now talking about how can they support local and regional produce in the priorities for how the school system goes out and buys food. Energy efficiency. This may seem a little bit like a tangent because it's, very buildings focused, but I think the more that we're really paying attention to strategies that drive down our energy use, drive down carbon pollution, help us make ourselves more resilient, we're also reducing the infiltration of mold into people's housing. We're reducing the number of emergency room visits. We're reducing absentee rates at schools for kids because their asthma isn't so bad. So it's part of this holistic strategy. We've already heard a little bit more about integrating nature into our cities and why that's so important for kids. But it needs to be an intentional strategy. And then, I thought a little bit about dropping this off because I know that you have been doing so much engagement with people as you've thought about your vision. But I think it's really important because it builds community in the process of making decisions. And then we heard this morning from Laura Spangen that the mayor has committed to a reduction of 80% carbon emissions by 2050. That's really terrific. I hope it gets a regional push as well. But what we're also seeing is that in the places that adopt and actualize these big goals, they're lowering the cost of living for the people who live in their communities. And that is what I think is going to get more people involved in this challenge. So, just like the two young guys, let's think about who we're doing a lot of this for. And thank you. I know we're a little behind.
I think we have some time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question.
Okay. Yeah.
I see a built-in inertia,
Uh-huh.
because I've been hearing stuff like you've been presenting for 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, it's not new.
And yet we don't implement, or we implement on a very small scale.
Yeah.
So I think that's great, but we really need to talk about how do we do that? How do we politically
Yes.
implement those things? And that's where we don't seem to really connect with.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, that's really exactly right, I think. None of these ideas are new. I think we have to get into the DNA and of what are the rules, for instance, that guide how our capital improvement budget is used. What are the screens by which the Department of Transportation evaluates proposals? We can do some of this through removing some rules. I think you're going to hear from Andres Duani tonight, and he's a big advocate of kind of letting the market deliver. I think that actually may be very helpful because the market, frankly, is far more aligned with this vision now than it ever has been. So we need to find a way to do that. Maybe it's specific parts of a city. But the most challenging problem, I think, is when we have a set of rules that guide where money is spent and what investors do in city development, and it doesn't line up with this vision, and so it's always an exception. It's always a little pilot project. So I'd say that'd be one place to start.
Of school districts that's driving down the cost of compostables and working on that. Do you know what that is?
Yeah, what is it called? It's the Urban School Food Alliance.
Is that available all over the country?
No, I think it's just like 4 or 5 or maybe half a dozen of the biggest school systems in the US. But I think they're trying to grow beyond their network, their first 4. Yeah.
First of all, I loved your 10 solutions.
Uh-huh.
And I agree with keeping it number 9. My question, however, is when some of those solutions end up being at odds. So
Yeah.
I happen to live and work in a neighborhood where number 1, number 5, and number 9 are in opposition. So a community that is very urban, and folks who live and work in that community want to maintain their culture of the community and see compact development as something that is going to displace that culture.
Oh, yes.
So
Yeah.
how do you reconcile, how do you find that common place of the 3 Venn diagrams of those 3 ideas,
Yeah.
where you are having meaningful community decision-making, retaining culture and identity of a community, but at the same time implementing those things that best practice tells us are good for healthy living?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a challenge that so many cities are facing right now. In part, I think, let's put it a little bit in context, there is not enough supply of the great neighborhoods, and that means all the attention gets focused onto a few, which creates a pressure that is unnerving. You know, I think that so many communities do not proactively address affordability in neighborhoods. They do not address what are the cultural aspects of this community that are really important and need to be saved, and then think creatively in advance about how it is we're going to pay for that, why, and find new ways of doing that. The traditional tools of zoning, for instance, which I understand here, but the traditional tools don't cut it. And waiting for the market to take care of those things just is not realistic. So I'd put those housing preservation, for instance, business support, cultural facility support first. Maybe some of the value that's created by all this new and groovy development that's coming in can help pay for that. Okay, well, thank you guys. Nice to meet you.